A millionaire forced his son to marry a humble farmer to punish him. However, he was stunned by what his son did. The heavy silence in Harry Thompson's office was suffocating. The polished mahogany desk, the walls lined with awards and certificates, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock all added to the oppressive atmosphere. David sat across from his father, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet Harry's cold, calculating gaze. "I'm done with your games, David," Harry finally said, his voice as firm as steel. "Your reckless behavior, the parties, the women, the money wasted on God knows what. It ends now." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd heard his father give speeches like this a dozen times before, but this time something felt different. There was a finality in Harry's tone that sent a shiver down his spine. "You think I'm just going to sit back and let you ruin everything I've built?" Harry continued, leaning forward, his sharp ice-blue eyes fixed on David's. "No more trust fund, no more endless credit cards, and no more freedom," David scoffed, trying to mask the unease creeping up his throat. "What? You're going to ground me, Dad? I'm not a teenager anymore." Harry's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't warm or kind. It was cold, almost cruel. "No, David, I'm not going to ground you. I'm going to fix you." David's brow furrowed in confusion. "Fix me? What the hell are you talking about?" "You're going to get married," Harry said simply, his tone leaving no room for debate. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Married? This had to be some kind of twisted joke. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You've lost it, old man. There's no way I'm getting married, not to anyone." Harry sat back in his chair, completely unfazed by David's defiance. "You don't have a choice." David's heart pounded in his chest. His father had always been controlling, but this was a new level of manipulation. "Who the hell do you think you are?" David spat, rising from his chair. "You can't just—" "I can," Harry interrupted, his voice calm and composed. "And I will." David's fists clenched at his sides, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. "Who is she, huh? Some high society debutante you picked out from one of your fancy parties?" Harry's expression remained impassive. "Her name is Eliza. She's a farmer." "A farmer?" David's voice cracked with disbelief. This had to be a joke, a sick, twisted joke. "Yes," Harry said, his voice cold. "She lives in Vermont. She's hardworking, honorable, and she lives a life that you desperately need to understand." David stared at his father, speechless. He had expected a lot of things from Harry: disappointment, anger, even punishment. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "You can't be serious," David finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "A farmer in Vermont? You want me to marry someone I've never even met and live in the middle of nowhere?" Harry didn't flinch. "Yes, consider it a fresh start." "This is insane," David yelled, his frustration pouring out. "You think you can control my life like this?" Harry stood up, towering over David. "I'm giving you one last chance, David. One last chance to prove that you're capable of being something more than a spoiled, irresponsible waste of space. You're going to marry Eliza, and you're going to live with her on that farm. You're going to learn what it means to work for something, to build something." "And if I don't?" David challenged, his voice low and dangerous. Harry's eyes narrowed. "Then you're done. No more money, no more support. You'll be cut off completely. And believe me, David, without my help, you won't last a month." The silence that followed was deafening. David's mind raced as he tried to process the ultimatum his father had just laid out. He could walk away, forget Eliza, forget Vermont, but that would mean losing everything. No money, no safety net. He'd be on his own for the first time in his life. Or he could go along with this insane plan, marry some random woman from the middle of nowhere and live on a farm like some commoner. It was humiliating. It was absurd. And yet the cold certainty in his father's eyes told David that this was real. There was no backing out. David slumped back into his chair, the weight of the decision crushing him. He didn't have a choice. Not really. Harry watched his son with a look of satisfaction. "You leave in 2 days. I suggest you get your affairs in order." David didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was sit there, drowning in the reality of the life his father had just forced upon him. As Harry turned and walked out of the room, David finally allowed himself to breathe. His life as he knew it was over. 2 days passed in a blur of disbelief and mounting dread. David found himself standing at the foot of a dusty gravel road, the kind of place he'd only seen in movies. He could hardly believe his life had come to this, a far cry from the glittering parties and penthouse views he was used to. Vermont smelled like earth and grass, the air too fresh for his liking. His city shoes sank slightly into the dirt as he stared down the narrow road leading to a farmhouse in the distance. This was where his father had sent him. With a heavy sigh, David picked up his suitcase and began the long walk toward the farmhouse, every step feeling like another nail in the coffin of his old life. The farmhouse was modest, with chipped white paint and a wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat in years. Despite its worn-down appearance, there was a certain charm to the place that he couldn't quite ignore. Still, it wasn't home, and it sure as hell wasn't where he belonged. As he approached, the front door creaked open, and there she was, Eliza. David hadn't known what to expect, but when he saw her, he was taken aback. She wasn't at all what he had imagined. Standing on the porch, she was dressed in faded jeans, worn boots, and a simple plaid shirt, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face was serious, unsmiling, but there was something undeniably strong about her presence, as if the land itself had shaped her resilience. She looked at him with eyes that didn't waver, even as she took in his expensive, out-of-place suit. "This is David Thompson?" she asked, her tone almost skeptical, as if Harry's promise had been too absurd to believe. David swallowed, his usual arrogance faltering under her steady gaze. "Yeah, that's me," he said, attempting to sound nonchalant. He dropped his suitcase on the porch with a loud thud. Eliza didn't respond right away. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. He felt exposed under her scrutiny, like she could see every privilege, every ounce of entitlement he carried with him. "I guess your father didn't tell you much about me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'll say this up front. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want it." David blinked, caught off guard. He'd assumed she was in on the whole thing, some desperate girl from the country who had jumped at the chance to marry into money. But her tone made it clear she had no interest in him, or whatever he thought he could offer. "That makes two of us," David replied, unable to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "I didn't exactly sign up for this either." Eliza nodded slightly, but there was no softening in her expression. She wasn't here to comfort him or make him feel better about their situation. "Well," she said, glancing at his suitcase, "you're here now. We might as well get on with it." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. David hesitated for a moment, staring after her, before picking up his bag and following her inside. The interior of the house was small, but clean, with well-worn furniture and a few personal touches that made the space feel lived in. It wasn't anything like the cold, sterile luxury of his penthouse apartment back in New York, but there was an undeniable warmth to it. "Your room's down the hall," Eliza called over her shoulder. "You can get settled in, and then I'll show you around." "Right," David muttered, dragging his suitcase along the wooden floor. He found the room at the end of the hall, a simple, sparse bedroom with a small bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the endless field. It was far from the life of excess he'd known, but he didn't expect to be staying here long. In his mind, this was temporary, a bump in the road before he could figure out how to get back to his real life. After dropping his suitcase on the bed, he rejoined Eliza in the kitchen where she was standing by the sink, looking out the window. She didn't acknowledge him when he entered, but the silence between them was heavy. "So what's the plan?" David asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "I assume we're supposed to what? Pretend to be married, play house on your little farm?" Eliza turned to face him, her expression unchanging. "We don't have to pretend anything, David. This is real, whether we like it or not." Her words stung more than he wanted to admit. There was something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, like she'd already come to terms with the arrangement, while he was still struggling to believe it was happening. "I run this farm," Eliza continued, her voice firm. "It's my livelihood. My father left it to me, and I'm not about to let it fall apart because you don't want to be here. So you're going to pull your weight." "Pull my weight?" David raised an eyebrow. "I don't know the first thing about farming." Eliza's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then you'll learn." Before he could respond, she turned back to the window, signaling the end of the conversation. David stood there feeling a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He was stuck in a life he didn't want, with a woman who clearly had no interest in making things easy for him. But there was no going back now. The first morning on the farm came far too early for David. He was used to sleeping in, waking up whenever the mood struck, often nursing a hangover from the night before. But here, the rooster crowed at dawn, a harsh reminder that his days of leisure were over. The sun wasn't even fully up when Eliza knocked on his door. "Get up," she called, her voice cutting through his grogginess like a knife. "We've got work to do." David groaned, rolling over in the small bed that creaked under his weight. Every fiber of his being wanted to ignore her, to pull the blankets over his head and pretend he was back in his New York penthouse. But the reality of his situation hit him hard. He couldn't afford to push back, not here. Grudgingly, he dragged himself out of bed, pulling on the same clothes he'd worn the day before. They already felt out of place here, too clean, too polished for the rough life he was about to step into. When he finally made his way outside, Eliza was already at work. Her sleeves rolled up as she moved through the barn carrying feed to the animals. "Grab that shovel," she said without looking up, her tone brisk. "You'll be mucking out the stalls today." David stared at her, incredulous. "Mucking out the what?" She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing in annoyance. "The stalls, David. You know, where the animals live. They need to be cleaned out every day." He glanced at the animals she was talking about. Horses, cows, a few pigs. They were looking back at him as if they too knew he didn't belong there. David grimaced, his stomach turning at the thought of what mucking out meant. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. But Eliza wasn't kidding. She didn't even dignify his complaint with a response, instead handing him the shovel and walking off to tend to something else. David stood there for a moment, holding the shovel awkwardly. He had no idea what he was doing, and it showed. With a resigned sigh, he approached the first stall, immediately recoiling at the smell. The reality of farm life hit him like a freight train. It was dirty, smelly, and uncomfortable in every possible way. There was nothing glamorous about it, but as much as he hated it, he knew there was no point in complaining. He was stuck here, and if he didn't at least pretend to try, Eliza would make his life even more miserable. He jabbed the shovel into the straw, gagging slightly at the sight of manure. This wasn't the kind of work someone like him was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be attending business lunches, playing golf with potential investors, enjoying the perks of wealth. Not this, never this. As the hours dragged on, David found himself sweating and aching in ways he never had before. His back screamed in protest every time he bent over, and his arms felt like they were made of lead. Every part of him wanted to quit, to throw the shovel down and walk away, but there was nowhere to go. Vermont stretched out around him for miles, isolating him from the world he'd known. The realization made him feel claustrophobic, trapped. At midday, Eliza came back, her face slightly softer, but still unreadable. "How's it going?" David wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at the half-done job with a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "How do you think it's going?" he snapped, too tired to hold back. Eliza didn't respond immediately, just walked over to inspect his work. "It's not bad," she said, her tone neutral, "but you're not done." David blinked at her, incredulous. "Not done? I've been at this for hours." "Farm work doesn't care about how long you've been doing it, it cares about getting done. So get back to it," Eliza said, handing him a bottle of water before turning back to her own tasks. He watched her walk away, a wave of resentment washing over him. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't made to break his back every day just to keep a farm running. This wasn't his life, and yet it was now. He had no choice. By the time the sun began to set, David's entire body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. His clothes were filthy, and his hands were blistered from gripping the shovel for hours on end. When he finally finished the last stall, he slumped against the side of the barn, too exhausted to move. Eliza appeared again, this time holding 2 plates of food, simple sandwiches, and a couple of apples. She handed one to him without a word and sat down beside him, looking out over the fields. "You'll get used to it," she said quietly, breaking the silence. David took a bite of the sandwich, too tired to argue. "I don't know if I will." Eliza glanced at him, her expression unreadable once more. "You will," she said with certainty. "People can adapt to a lot more than they think." They sat in silence after that, the weight of the day hanging heavy in the air. The farm was quiet now, the animals settled, the sun casting long shadows across the fields. For the first time since arriving, David found a strange sense of calm washing over him. It wasn't the life he wanted, but there was something about the simplicity of it all, something that for just a brief moment made him feel less lost. But the calm didn't last long. As the evening breeze blew through the trees, David was reminded of the life he'd left behind, the life waiting for him if he ever figured out how to escape this place. Vermont might have been peaceful, but it wasn't home. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and David's life on the farm settled into a grueling routine. He woke up before dawn, spent hours performing menial tasks, and went to bed exhausted, only to repeat the cycle the next day. Despite his best efforts to resist, the rhythms of farm life were pulling him in, whether he liked it or not. But no matter how much he tried to throw himself into the work, the tension between him and Eliza remained. They barely spoke outside of the necessities of running the farm, their interactions short and to the point. David wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by a woman. Back in New York, he had always been the center of attention. Here, he was just another pair of hands. One evening, after an especially long day in the fields, David found himself pacing the kitchen, the silence of the house gnawing at him. Eliza was outside tending to the animals for the night. He could see her through the window, her figure moving with purpose as it always did. There was something about the way she carried herself that unnerved him. She was strong, self-reliant, and completely unaffected by him. It was almost insulting. David grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out at the darkening sky. His frustration was mounting, and it had nowhere to go. He had never felt so out of control in his life. This was supposed to be temporary, a punishment sure, but one that he could ride out until his father came to his senses. But now he wasn't so sure. Harry hadn't called, hadn't checked in, hadn't even sent a word. It was as if he'd been abandoned out here. As the door creaked open, Eliza stepped into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a rag. She glanced at David but said nothing, moving toward the sink to wash up. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken resentment. David couldn't take it anymore. "Do you enjoy this?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Eliza didn't turn around. "Enjoy what?" "This," David gestured around the kitchen, frustration lacing his words. "This whole thing, having me here, dealing with this ridiculous situation. Do you enjoy watching me struggle out there looking like an idiot every day?" Eliza finally turned, her face unreadable as always. "I didn't ask for this any more than you did." "That's not an answer," David shot back, his voice rising. "You've been treating me like an outsider since the day I got here. I get it, I'm not a farmer, but I'm trying." "Does that mean anything to you?" Eliza took a deep breath, setting the rag down on the counter. "Trying? You've been here what, a month? You still act like this is all temporary, like you're going to pack up and leave any day now. I've lived my whole life on this farm. It's not some punishment to me, David. It's my life." David blinked, taken aback by the firmness in her voice. He hadn't really thought about it that way. To him, this was just a temporary prison. To her, it was home. "I never asked to be here," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "None of this makes sense." Eliza crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. "No, it doesn't. But that doesn't change the fact that you are here. And if you're going to stay, then stop acting like the world owes you something. No one's going to hold your hand out here." David's frustration flared again. "I didn't ask for anyone to hold my hand, but I'm also not used to being treated like I don't exist." Eliza's expression softened, but only slightly. "I don't treat you like you don't exist, David. I treat you like a grown man who has a lot to learn. You want me to pat you on the back for every little thing you do? That's not how this works." The words stung, but David couldn't deny the truth in them. He'd spent his entire life being praised for even the smallest accomplishments, constantly surrounded by people who told him how great he was. Out here, there were no easy wins, and Eliza certainly wasn't the type to hand out praise just for showing up. "I'm trying," David said again, this time more quietly. "I really am." Eliza studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I know. But trying isn't enough. You have to commit. You have to actually want to be here, not just go through the motions until you can leave." David looked away, unsure of how to respond. Did he want to be here? Not really, but he didn't want to go back to New York either. Not yet, at least. The thought of returning to his old life, where everything was handed to him, didn't sit right anymore. Something had shifted, even if he wasn't ready to admit it to himself. "I guess we'll see," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. Eliza didn't press further. Instead, she turned back to the sink, her focus shifting back to the tasks at hand. The conversation was over, but the tension lingered, a quiet reminder of the gap between them that still needed to be bridged. David stood in the kitchen for a while longer, feeling the weight of the silence settle around him again. He wasn't used to being this out of control, this powerless, but maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what his father wanted all along. As he made his way back to his small bedroom, the sense of frustration clung to him, but somewhere underneath there was a flicker of something else, something that felt almost like resolve. The days rolled on, each one blending into the next, but something had started to shift in David's routine. He still hated the early mornings, the grueling work, and the blistering summer sun that beat down on him relentlessly. But somewhere in the monotony of farm life, he began to notice things. Little things. The quiet, for one. The stillness of the mornings before the rest of the world seemed to wake up. Back in New York, his mornings were filled with noise, traffic, phones ringing, people moving in a hurry. But here, the only sounds were the soft rustle of the trees, the distant clucking of the chickens, and the gentle hum of the wind sweeping across the open fields. At first it was unsettling, like the silence was too loud, but now he found it almost peaceful. David still couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, but there were moments when, standing in the field with the sun low on the horizon, he felt like he was a part of something larger than himself. It was a strange sensation, one that he didn't quite know how to process. One evening, after a long day of hauling hay, he sat on the porch steps, staring out over the fields. Eliza was out with the chickens, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. She moved with a quiet efficiency, always working, always focused. Watching her, David couldn't help but feel a grudging respect. She ran the farm like it was second nature, with a determination he'd never seen in anyone before. As Eliza walked back toward the house, she caught his gaze, but didn't look away. Instead, she came up the steps and sat down beside him, her hands resting on her knees. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant buzz of insects and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. "You're getting better," Eliza said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice wasn't overly warm, but there was a note of acknowledgement there. David raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected comment. "At what? Shoveling manure?" Eliza's lips twitched, almost like she was fighting back a smile. "At the work. You're not half as useless as you were when you first got here." David snorted. "Well, thanks, I guess. That's the nicest thing you've said to me in a month." Eliza didn't respond immediately, just leaned back against the porch railing and looked out over the farm. "This isn't easy, David," she said after a moment. "Running a place like this, it takes everything you've got. Some people break under it." I've seen it happen." David looked over at her, watching as she spoke. There was a weariness in her voice, but not weakness. It was the kind of weariness that came from carrying the weight of responsibility for too long without anyone to share it with. He realized then just how much Eliza had been doing, day in and day out, without complaint, without help. "I don't know how you do it," David admitted, his voice low. "I can barely keep up with the work, and you make it look easy." Eliza shook her head. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. If I don't do it, the farm doesn't survive. My father left this place to me, and I'll be damned if I let it fall apart." There was something in her words that resonated with David. The way she spoke about the farm wasn't just practical, it was personal. The farm wasn't just a place to her. It was her legacy, her connection to her family, her identity. "I never had that," David said, almost without thinking. "That sense of purpose. I always thought I was supposed to follow in my father's footsteps, but I never really cared about any of it. It was just expected." Eliza glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Then maybe this is your chance to find something that matters to you." David didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what mattered to him. His life in New York had been all about appearances, money, status, power. None of it had ever felt real. But here on the farm, for all its hardship and isolation, there was something undeniably real about it. The work was tangible, the results immediate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. "I don't know," David said finally. "Maybe I'm still figuring that out." Eliza nodded, not pressing the issue. Instead, she stood up, brushing the dirt off her jeans. "Well, I guess we'll see. For now, there's still work to do tomorrow." David watched as she headed back inside, leaving him alone on the porch. The sky was fading into a deep blue, the stars just beginning to poke through. He stayed there for a while, thinking about what she had said, finding something that mattered. It was a simple idea, but it gnawed at him. Maybe Eliza was right. Maybe this was his chance to find something real, something meaningful. But the thought scared him. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind wealth and privilege that he wasn't sure if he knew how to be anyone else. As the night deepened, David finally stood up and walked inside, the quiet of the farm settling around him like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to swim. The next few days brought a strange sense of rhythm to David's life on the farm. He was still far from mastering the work, but something had shifted. Instead of dragging his feet, he began to approach each day with more determination. His hands were still blistered, and his muscles ached in places he didn't know existed. But it didn't feel as overwhelming as it had in the beginning. One morning, as the sun began to rise, David found himself outside early, waiting for Eliza to give him his tasks for the day. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but at some point, he'd stopped dreading the mornings. There was something about the quiet before the day truly began that was almost calming. Standing there with the cool breeze on his face and the distant sounds of the animals waking up, he felt a strange sense of peace. Eliza came out of the house shortly after, her usual no-nonsense expression in place. She gave him a quick glance, noting his early appearance, but said nothing. Instead, she walked toward the barn, and David followed without a word. "I'm going to show you how to tend to the horses today," Eliza said as they reached the stable. "It's not just about feeding them or cleaning up after them. You need to learn how to care for them properly." David nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that entailed. He'd seen horses before at country clubs or racetracks, but he'd never actually been close to one, let alone cared for one. Still, he followed Eliza into the barn, trying to look like he knew what he was doing. Eliza led him to a tall bay horse, its deep brown coat gleaming in the morning light. "This is Duke," she said, patting the horse's neck gently. "He's one of the older ones, but he's strong and reliable." David stood awkwardly by, watching as Eliza worked with the horse, her movements confident and sure. She showed him how to brush the horse's coat, explaining the importance of checking for any cuts or sores. Then she handed him the brush. "Your turn." she said simply. David hesitated for a moment, but then took the brush and stepped closer to Duke. The horse shifted slightly, its large eyes watching him with mild curiosity. David could feel the size and power of the animal, and for a brief moment, he wondered if it would sense his inexperience and bolt. But Duke stood still, seemingly patient as David began to brush his coat. It wasn't long before David found a rhythm, his movements becoming smoother and more confident. Eliza watched him for a while before moving on to the next horse, letting him work in peace. As he brushed Duke's coat, David felt a strange connection forming, one he hadn't expected. The work was calming, methodical, and for once, he didn't feel like he was completely out of his depth. When he finished with Duke, Eliza came back over, inspecting his work with a critical eye. "Not bad," she said, her voice devoid of any patronizing tone. "You've got the hang of it." David couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride at her words. It wasn't much, but it was the first time she had acknowledged his progress without any backhanded remarks or sarcasm. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn her respect. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Eliza continued to show him the ins and outs of farm work, how to mend a fence, how to properly feed and water the livestock, and even how to drive the old tractor that had been sitting near the barn for as long as David could remember. He wasn't great at any of it, but he was getting better, slowly but surely. By the time the sun began to set, David was exhausted, his muscles sore from the day's work. But for once, he didn't feel defeated. Instead, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. As they wrapped up for the day, Eliza handed him a bucket of water, gesturing toward the barn. "You're responsible for the horses now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Make sure they're taken care of every morning and every night." David blinked, surprised. "You're giving me responsibility already?" Eliza shrugged. "You've proven you can handle it. If you mess it up, we'll know soon enough." It wasn't exactly a glowing endorsement, but David couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. She was trusting him with something important, something that mattered to the farm. It wasn't just about keeping up appearances or going through the motions anymore. He had a real role to play. That night, as he lay in bed, David found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind. It had been hard, harder than anything he'd done in New York, but it had also felt right in a way. The work wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it was real, tangible. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was actually contributing to something. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking about how to escape the farm. Instead, he was starting to wonder if there was something more here, something worth staying for. It was a quiet thought, one he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge yet, but as he drifted off to sleep, the idea lingered, settling in the back of his mind like a seed waiting to grow. The storm hit without warning. The early morning sky had been a muted gray, thick with clouds, but by midday the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. David had been out in the field when the first fat raindrops began to fall, and before he knew it, the sky had opened up, releasing a torrent of rain that turned the ground into a muddy quagmire. "Get the animals inside," Eliza shouted over the roar of the wind as she ran past him, her hair whipped around by the storm. David sprinted after her, his feet sinking into the mud as the rain pelted down harder. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Inside the barn, the horses whined nervously, sensing the shift in the weather. David quickly set to work helping Eliza secure the doors and make sure the animals were safe. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins as the wind battered the barn walls, rattling the loose boards and making everything feel precarious. "Are they all inside?" David asked breathlessly, wiping the rain from his face. Eliza nodded, her face tense. "We need to check the fences. If the storm knocks any of them down, the animals could get out." Without hesitation, the two of them raced back out into the storm, the rain stinging their skin as they ran toward the far edge of the field where the fence line stretched. David could barely see a few feet in front of him through the sheets of rain. But Eliza moved with purpose, leading the way. When they reached the fence, they could see that parts of it were already leaning dangerously, the wind threatening to tear it apart at any moment. "We need to reinforce it," Eliza shouted, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. David grabbed a hammer and some nails from the nearby shed, his hands shaking as he tried to secure the fence. The rain was relentless, soaking through his clothes and making every movement more difficult. Eliza was beside him, her hands working quickly and efficiently despite the conditions. They didn't have time to talk, just work. Every second felt like a race against the storm. Finally, after what felt like hours, they managed to secure the last section of the fence. Both of them stood there, panting, drenched to the bone and utterly exhausted. The wind hadn't let up, but the fence held steady, and for now, the animals were safe. David looked over at Eliza, her face streaked with rain and mud, her hair plastered to her forehead. There was a fire in her eyes, a resilience that he couldn't help but admire. She caught his gaze and gave him a brief nod, just a small acknowledgement of the work they had done, but it was enough. They had survived the worst of it together. "Let's get back inside," Eliza said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "We're no good to the farm if we're both sick tomorrow." They made their way back to the farmhouse, the storm still raging outside. Inside, the warmth of the house felt almost surreal after the chaos of the storm. They stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the floor, both of them too tired to speak for a moment. "Thank you," Eliza said quietly, breaking the silence. "For helping." David, still catching his breath, shrugged. "I didn't really have a choice, did I?" Eliza gave a small smile, one of the first he had seen since he'd arrived. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make something inside him shift again. That slow, creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand each other. "I'll get a fire started," David said, surprising himself. He wasn't sure why he offered, but after weeks of working beside Eliza, he had picked up enough about how to survive here that it didn't feel like an impossible task. As the fire crackled in the small living room, the storm continued to beat against the windows. David sat across from Eliza, the warmth from the fire slowly thawing his cold, aching limbs. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable for the first time. "It was like this when my father died," Eliza said suddenly, her voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the fire. David looked up, caught off guard by the shift in tone. "A storm, I mean. It tore through the farm, just like today. We lost half the crops that year." David wasn't sure how to respond. He had never really asked Eliza about her life before he came here. He had been too wrapped up in his own misery to care. But now, hearing her talk about her father, he realized how little he actually knew about the person sitting across from him. "How old were you?" he asked quietly. 23, Eliza replied, her eyes fixed on the flames. He had been sick for a while, but it still felt sudden. One minute he was here, and the next, everything was gone. It was just me trying to keep the farm going. David leaned back, processing her words. He had always thought of the farm as a burden, something his father had forced upon him. But for Eliza, it was her legacy, her responsibility. She had fought for this place alone and had managed to keep it going through sheer will. "I didn't realize," David admitted, his voice low. "I mean, I didn't think about what this place meant to you. I've been so focused on how much I hate being here that I never stopped to think about what it's been like for you." Eliza's gaze softened, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't expect you to," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You weren't sent here because you wanted to be, but that doesn't mean you can't learn to care about it." They sat in silence again, the weight of her words sinking in. David wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't even sure what he felt. All he knew was that something had shifted between them, something small but significant. For the first time, he saw Eliza not just as the woman he had been forced to marry, but as someone who had survived her own battles, someone who had fought for her place in the world. And for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could fight for something too. The days following the storm were quieter, more reflective. The air still smelled of rain, the fields still soaked from the downpour, but the farm had survived, and so had David and Eliza. For David, something had changed during that storm. The backbreaking labor, the endless tasks, and the grueling days no longer felt like punishment, at least not in the way they had before. He was still exhausted by the end of every day, still unsure of where he fit in this strange new life, but there was a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, he could handle it. Then came the phone call from his father. It had been nearly 2 months since Harry had last spoken to him, since he'd sent David off to Vermont like a child being punished. David had expected a check-in much sooner, but his father had remained silent until now. Eliza was outside when David answered the phone, wiping his hands on his jeans as he glanced through the kitchen window. His father's voice was crisp and businesslike, as it always was, with none of the warmth one might expect from a father speaking to his son. "David," Harry said, not bothering with small talk. "How's life on the farm?" David hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's fine," he replied cautiously. "What's this about, Dad?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that David had learned to dread. His father was calculating, always planning his next move, always one step ahead, and David knew that whatever was about to come next wasn't just a casual check-in. "I have an offer for you," Harry said finally, his voice smooth. "You've been out there long enough. I think it's time for you to come home." David's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this, waiting for the moment when his father would call him back, offer him a way out. But now that it was here, something didn't feel right. He glanced out the window again, watching as Eliza worked in the distance, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "What kind of offer?" David asked slowly, wary of where this conversation was headed. "You've proven you can handle responsibility," Harry said, "at least in the sense that you haven't completely failed out there. I'm willing to bring you back into the fold, back into the company. But there are conditions." Of course there were. There were always conditions with Harry Thompson. Nothing came without strings attached. "And what are those conditions?" David asked, his jaw tightening. "You'll return to New York, take up a position at the company, and you'll leave the farm." "You'll leave Eliza," Harry said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "This was always meant to be temporary, David. I didn't expect you to stay out there forever. Now it's time to come home." David's stomach churned at the cold finality of his father's words. Leave the farm. Leave Eliza. It was so simple to Harry, so black and white. David could feel the weight of the offer settling on his shoulders, suffocating him. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? To get out, to return to his old life, to escape the farm and everything it represented. But now, standing in the kitchen of that small farmhouse, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter, David wasn't sure anymore. He had hated this place when he first arrived. Hated the work, hated the isolation, hated everything about it. But over the last few weeks, something had shifted. The farm had become something more than just a punishment. It had become real. And Eliza. Eliza wasn't just the woman he had been forced to marry. She had become something else. Someone else. He didn't know exactly what she meant to him yet, but the thought of leaving her, of walking away from this life and going back to the cold, sterile world of New York, made his chest tighten with a sense of loss he hadn't expected. "I don't know," David said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Harry's voice hardened. "This isn't a request, David. I'm giving you a way out. Don't be a fool. You don't belong out there. Come home and take your place where you belong." David stared out the window, his mind racing. This was his chance to get everything back. The money, the power, the life he had always known, but at what cost? Could he really walk away from the farm, from Eliza, from the strange, uncertain future that had started to take root here? "I need to think about it," David said finally, his voice tight. Harry's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Don't take too long," he said coldly. "You don't have forever." The line went dead, and David was left standing in the kitchen, the phone still in his hand, the weight of his father's ultimatum hanging over him like a storm cloud. The next morning, David woke up with a knot in his stomach. His father's offer loomed over him like a dark cloud, casting a shadow on everything he did. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of test, another move in Harry's never-ending game of control. But this time, the stakes felt different. David went through the motions of the morning chores, but his mind wasn't on the work. It was on Eliza, on the farm, on New York, on the life he had once wanted so desperately to return to, and the life he had unexpectedly found here. The two worlds felt so far apart, and yet Harry was asking him to choose between them. He couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. After dinner, David found Eliza in the living room reading by the light of the fire. She glanced up when he entered, but didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak. "We need to talk," David said, his voice tight. Eliza closed her book and set it aside, her expression serious. "What's going on?" David took a deep breath, the words heavy on his tongue. "My father called yesterday. He offered me a way out." Eliza didn't react right away. She just stared at him, her face carefully blank. "A way out? He wants me to come back to New York, to take a position at the company, but—" David hesitated, the weight of the next part making his chest ache. "But if I go back, I have to leave the farm. Leave you." Eliza's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something David couldn't read. She stood up, walking over to the window and looking out into the night. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick and tense. "So what are you going to do?" she asked quietly, still not looking at him. David ran a hand through his hair, feeling more lost than ever. "I don't know. This is what I wanted, right? To go back, to leave all of this behind?" Eliza turned to face him, her gaze steady, but filled with a kind of sadness that cut through him. "Is it? Is that really what you want?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, David didn't have an immediate answer. He had spent so much of his life chasing after what he thought he wanted: money, status, power. But now, standing in this old farmhouse, surrounded by the quiet of the countryside, he wasn't sure anymore. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I wanted. It doesn't feel the same anymore. Not after being here, not after meeting you." Eliza's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. "Then maybe you've changed. Maybe this place, this life, maybe it's become something more than just a punishment." David looked at her, the firelight casting warm shadows across her face. She had always been strong, always been the one who held everything together. But now he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the unspoken question of whether he would stay or leave. And suddenly, the decision didn't feel so impossible. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't want to leave, Eliza. I don't want to go back to New York and pretend like none of this ever happened. I don't want to pretend like you don't matter." Eliza blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I want to stay," David said, the words spilling out with a kind of certainty he hadn't felt in weeks. "I want to stay here with you." For a moment, Eliza just stared at him, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. Then slowly, her lips curved into a small, tentative smile. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Rich said, pulling her closer. "I'm more sure of this than I've ever been about anything." Eliza's smile grew, and for the first time, David saw a softness in her that she had kept hidden for so long. She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the weight of the decision lifting off David's shoulders. The next morning, when Harry called again, David answered with a new sense of clarity. "I've made my decision," David said firmly, his voice unwavering. Harry didn't respond right away, the silence on the other end of the line heavy with expectation. "And I'm staying here," David said, the words coming easily now. "I'm not coming back to New York, not to the company, not to the life I had. I'm staying on the farm." There was another long pause, and then Harry's voice turned cold. "You're throwing everything away, David. For what? A farm? A woman you barely know? This is a mistake." David's jaw tightened, but his resolve didn't waver. Maybe it is, but it's my mistake to make." Harry's silence was deafening, and for a moment, David thought his father might hang up. But then Harry spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "If you walk away from this, you're on your own. No money, no support. You'll be cut off for good." David took a deep breath, letting the reality of his father's words sink in. He had known this was coming, known that Harry would never let him go without a fight. But now, standing in the small farmhouse that had become his home, with Eliza by his side, the threat didn't scare him anymore. "That's fine," David said quietly. "I don't need your money." For the first time in his life, David felt free. The conversation with his father left a heavy weight on David's chest, but as he hung up the phone, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. It was strange, cutting ties with the life he had known for so long. The luxury, the power, the sense of control. It was all gone, but in its place was something else, something more solid, more real. He walked out onto the porch where the late afternoon sun bathed the fields in a soft golden light. Eliza was in the distance, tending to the animals as usual, and David couldn't help but smile at the sight of her. Everything about this life, about her, felt right in a way he couldn't quite put into words. Just as he was about to join her, a familiar black car pulled up to the farmhouse, its sleek form so out of place in the rustic setting. David's stomach turned when he saw who stepped out of the car. Harry Thompson, looking as sharp and intimidating as ever, walked toward the house with purpose. His suit was immaculate, not a hair out of place, as if the dirt roads and fields didn't exist in his world. David hadn't seen his father in months, and the sudden appearance felt like a punch to the gut. Eliza noticed Harry from the distance and stopped what she was doing, walking toward the house with a cautious expression. She could sense the tension even from afar. "What are you doing here?" David asked, stepping off the porch and meeting his father halfway. Harry's eyes were cold as he looked around, his gaze settling on the farmhouse, the fields, the animals. "I had to see for myself, to see what could possibly make my son turn his back on everything I've built." David clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I'm not turning my back on anything. I'm making my own life, something you've never let me do." Harry gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Your own life? Out here with this farm? You think this is some grand rebellion, David, but it's not. You're throwing everything away for what? A woman you don't even know? A life you're not built for?" Eliza stepped up beside David, her expression calm, but wary. She met Harry's gaze, her chin held high, not backing down from his intimidating presence. David couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for her in that moment. "This isn't a rebellion," David said, his voice steady. "It's me choosing something different, something real." Harry's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think this is real? You don't even know the truth." David frowned, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Harry glanced at Eliza, then back at David, his gaze icy. "The marriage. You think it was my idea? You think I was the one who arranged it?" David's stomach dropped, confusion and dread swirling in his gut. "What are you saying?" Harry crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Eliza came to me first. She needed the money to save this place. The farm was failing and she was desperate. She proposed the marriage, said she'd do whatever it took to keep this farm. I just happened to see an opportunity to teach you a lesson." The words hit David like a physical blow. He turned to Eliza, his heart racing. "Is that true?" Eliza's face paled, but she didn't look away. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a sadness that David hadn't seen before. "It's true," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I did go to your father, but it wasn't because I wanted to manipulate you. It was because I didn't have a choice. The farm was in trouble, and I couldn't let it go under. I did what I had to do to survive." David's chest tightened, anger and betrayal swirling in his mind. He felt blindsided, like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. All this time he had believed that Harry had orchestrated everything, that he had been the one pulling the strings. But now, hearing that Eliza had been part of it, it changed everything. "You should have told me," David said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You should have been honest." Eliza's eyes filled with regret, but she didn't back down. "I know I should have, but I didn't know how. I was scared you'd leave and the farm would be lost. I thought if we could just get through it, maybe things would change." Harry watched the exchange with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the chaos he had caused. "See, David? This was never about love or building a new life. It was about survival, just like everything else in this world." David turned back to his father, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to walk in here and act like you're the hero in this. You pushed me into this life. You set all of this up knowing how it would play out. You don't care about me. You never have." Harry's face hardened, the smugness gone. "I was trying to save you from yourself, David. You've always been weak, always chasing after things that don't matter. This was supposed to be a lesson." David shook his head, stepping forward. "I'm not weak, not anymore. You might have set this up, but I stayed because I wanted to. And now I'm choosing to stay." Harry's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," David replied, his voice firm. "But it's mine to make." For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. Harry stood there, his jaw clenched, clearly furious that David wasn't backing down. But David didn't care anymore. For the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own life. Harry finally turned and walked back to his car without another word. The sound of the engine revving to life filled the quiet, and within moments, he was gone, leaving David and Eliza standing there in the fading light. David turned to Eliza, his chest still tight with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd leave, and I didn't want you to go." David took a deep breath, the anger slowly melting away. He stepped forward, taking her hand. "I'm not leaving, Eliza. Not now. Not ever." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Even after everything?" David nodded, his voice soft but sure. "Even after everything." The days after Harry's visit passed quietly, but the weight of his revelation still lingered between David and Eliza. The truth had come out, and it left scars that weren't easy to ignore. Yet despite the hurt, something stronger had begun to grow, a resolve to move forward together, no matter what. David had made his choice, and he wasn't going to back down from it. The farm, the life he was building with Eliza, had become something real to him, something that no amount of money or power in New York could replace. But more importantly, Eliza had become more than just the woman his father had forced him to marry. She was his partner, and he wasn't going to let the past destroy what they had. One evening, as the sun began to set over the fields, David found Eliza sitting on the porch, her hands resting in her lap as she gazed out over the land she had fought so hard to protect. He sat down beside her, the familiar creak of the porch boards settling beneath him. "You've been quiet," David said gently, glancing at her. Eliza didn't respond right away, but after a moment she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I've been thinking." David waited, giving her the space she needed. He had learned over the past few months that Eliza wasn't one to rush her words. She was careful, deliberate, and when she spoke, it always carried weight. "I've been thinking about us," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "About how we got here. Everything that's happened. I don't want to pretend like it didn't hurt, David. The way this all started, the way I kept the truth from you. It wasn't fair to either of us." David nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. "I know, but I also know why you did it. I get it now." Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, regret, hope, and something else he couldn't quite name. I didn't know if you'd still want to stay after everything." David reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm here because I want to be, Eliza. Not because of my father or the deal you made. I'm staying because I want this. I want us." She blinked, her lips trembling slightly as she fought back tears. It was rare to see Eliza so vulnerable, so open, but David knew that this was as real as it got. She had been carrying so much on her own for so long, and now she was letting him in. "You don't know how much that means to me," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. David squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I think I do. We've both been through a lot, and I won't pretend like it'll be easy, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." Eliza nodded, her eyes locking with his. "So am I." For a long moment, they just sat there, the silence between them comfortable and full of promise. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the fields. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made everything feel possible, even after all the pain and uncertainty they had faced. "I think this is the first time I've really felt like I belong here," David said after a while, his voice soft, but filled with a sense of peace he hadn't known before. Eliza smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I think you do. You've changed, David. You found your place." He couldn't argue with that. The man he had been when he first arrived on the farm was long gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of hard work, of resilience, of love. The farm had tested him in ways he never expected, and it had given him more than he ever could have imagined. "I guess I have," he agreed, his heart full, "and I'm not going anywhere." As the days turned into weeks, David and Eliza worked side by side to build their life together. The farm, once a symbol of his father's punishment, had become a place of growth, of new beginnings. They repaired fences, tended to the animals, and planned for the future with a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they stood by the barn watching the sunset, David turned to Eliza, his heart swelling with gratitude for the life they were building together. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "this is more than I ever thought I'd have, more than I ever thought I'd want." Eliza smiled softly, her hand slipping into his. "Me too." They stood there watching the sun sink below the horizon, knowing that the challenges weren't over, but also knowing that they were ready to face them together. The farm, their home, was no longer just a piece of land. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they had yet to build. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, David knew with certainty that he had found something far more valuable than any amount of money or success in New York could ever offer. He had found purpose, love, and the life he had never known he needed. Together, they were ready for whatever came next.